When an item is selected with the generic slot inventory component, such as this cube item, or this jump booster that makes you jump a little higher, or this print string item, all this behavior is defined through the player character blueprint. Every item selection gets forwarded to the player character to determine what should happen when an item is selected. What I mean by this is that the generic slot inventory component is not responsible for triggering the item behavior when an item is selected. If you select a weapon item, this slot inventory component doesn't come with weapon logic that automatically gets applied. When you create this cube item info that spawns cubes, the inventory component has no idea that you're trying to spawn a cube. It just defers that logic to your player character blueprint. Now, if we open up our character in the provided example here, we'll see that one of the first things we do on begin play is that we bind an event inside the slot inventory component called onItemSelected. Now, this event has an argument called selectedItem, and this is simply the selected item that we've selected by our player. Now, if you want to handle multiplayer selections, one really easy way to do this is if you're the multiplayer client, simply forward your selected item to the server and let the server then handle what happens when that player selects an item. In the provided example, there are two sorts of branches for item selection logic. Your player character can handle item selection any way it wants to. For example, we have a kind of very rudimentary weapon system in this example to show you how you can split weapons and other items and combine that logic together. Now, I'm not going to cover how the weapon system works in this video, but that will be in another video for this project. So we're going to go ahead and skip this explanation for now and move on to what's called item invoking. Now, if we select an item that's not a weapon for our character will then skip this weapon logic, again that's specific only to weapons, and it'll call this invoke function on our selected item. Now every item info has a function called invoke, and you can override this function to do really anything you want. You are given the invoker, which is the actor who has invoked it, which should be your player character. And from there, your item can do whatever you program it to do. Now, the print string item, for example, will just print a random string unless it's given a supplied message to print. When it returns after this invoke, it returns two things. It returns whether it was successfully invoked and whether it should be consumed. Now, again, when an item is selected, all the item behavior is deferred to the player character blueprint. Meaning, even though this item info has a concept of what it does inside its invoke method, this invoke method isn't called automatically by the slot inventory component, because this invoke function is more of a convenient optional function to help you get started with some behaviors right away. But it is up to you to call invoke on an item that you've selected if you'd like to invoke that item. If we go back to our character blueprint, we can see that when we select a weapon item, we don't call invoke. Instead, we handle the logic a little differently because our weapon system is a little bit more complicated than a simple consumable item that does a one-time effect. However, for all the other items in this example, they are one-time effects that are consumable. So by knowing this in our character blueprint, we take a look to see if after we call invoke, whether or not should be consumed is true. Now, if the item reports that it should be consumed, it's up to the player character to remove that item from the slot inventory component. The reason for this is the slot inventory component does not want to make any assumptions about the state of your game. For example, if your character has a cheat code or some sort of power-up enabled where consumable items no longer are consumed for a temporary amount of time, there would be no easy way to do that without editing the component directly. So instead, the component just defers this to your player character. So it's up to your player character to remove the item from the inventory rather than it being done by itself. Now this does add a small step of implementation into your project, but I find that this is for the better, because then you can define much more complex behaviors without being bound and fixed to the inner workings of the slot inventory component. The slot inventory component really just manages inventory and alerts you when an item is selected. This invoke method is completely optional. You don't have to use it for your items. If you want to instead say, I want to handle the print string item selection myself, what you could do is you can grab that selected item and cast it to that print string item and then handle whatever explicit behavior you want to happen when that item is selected here. But I find that having 100 casts for a bunch of simple items is sort of inconvenient, which is why this invoke function exists. Again, this invoke function is just a helper so that if you know that a particular item isn't a special case item and you just want the item to be able to call whatever it should be doing when invoked, you simply shove that logic into the invoke function. The default invoke function does nothing, for example. It is up to child classes to determine what invoking really means. Again, looking at the jump booster item, we see that when this is invoked, we try to get the character movement component of the invoker, and if that exists, which it usually should, we go ahead and we increase the jump Z velocity by some jump boost factor defined in the item. And if we're able to do that, we return that we've been invoked and that we should be consumed. Now, this item has no logic to handle its own consumption from the invoker's inventory. Again, it is up to the invokee, which is usually your player character, to handle consumption. Again, this is completely optional, and if you want to handle your item selections on a case-by-case basis, such as what we do for weapon selection, you're free to do that as well. It's just very important to note that the slot inventory component does not define what happens when your item is selected. It simply alerts you that an item has been selected, and it defers that logic to you.